Good evening, everyone. My name is Zela Astarjan, and I'm your AIWA host today. I welcome you to another of AIWA's virtual events, where I wish it was under better circumstances. As you well know, Armenia is facing yet another Azerbaijani aggression, much more threatening than in the past. As an organization concerned about the welfare of our nation, and especially of women, we realize the implications of war beyond the political. There's loss, displacements, and families torn apart. And women must display courage in the most horrific conditions, invisible from politicians and media attention. Our future and societal ties will be impacted by the reality of war and its influence. And as always, AIWA stands to advocate for human rights and peace building. Today, we have a roundtable discussion about the regional and global implications of Azerbaijan's war against Armenia. We hope you will gain valuable insight about the current situation from experts in their field. And Sossi Jan, thank you so much for joining us from Armenia, where it is 1:30 a.m. right now.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you all, actually, all the panelists. But before we begin, I'd like to ask you to please type in the chat box at the bottom of your screen the city, state, and country from where you are connecting. Actually, when I looked at the registrant list today, we have folks joining us from Armenia, from London, from Quebec, Montreal, and of course the US. So grateful for all of the attendance. Please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A section. And this is going to be recorded, and we will send this to all registrants. Let me take a minute to introduce our panelists today. Our moderator is Dr. Anna Ohanyan, who's a previous AIWA board member and a great supporter of AIWA. She's a distinguished professor of political science and international relations at Stonehill College here in Massachusetts. She's also a non-resident senior scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a two-time Fulbright scholar to South Caucasus. She has authored 5 books. Her latest book is titled The Neighborhood Effect, The Imperial Roots of Regional Fracture in Eurasia. And she has consulted for numerous organizations such as the United Nations Foundation, the World Bank, and the US State Department, among others. And she's also authored numerous articles. Dr. Nerses Kopalyan is an assistant professor in residence of political science at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. His fields of specialization include international relations, political theory, and philosophy of science. His current research concentrates on political violence and terrorism and its impact on geopolitical and great power relations. Sossi Tatikyan, who's joining us from Armenia, is an independent consultant on foreign policy and security governance. She has worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Armenia for over a decade, including as a deputy head of the mission to NATO. She spent more than a decade in the UN peacekeeping and political missions in Kosovo, East Timor, and other countries. She's a member of the UN Senior Women Talent Pipeline and UN SSR Advisory Network. Since 2019, Sossi has been consulting for UNDP, US Freedom House, and has been involved in peace building and public diplomacy papers on conflict resolution, peacekeeping, and human rights. At this point, I'd like to turn this over to Anna Ohanyan, who will be moderating this webinar today. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Zela, for the introductions and more importantly for organizing this forum. And it's great to see AIWA being such a big part of this particular forum on this topic. I wish the circumstances were different, of course. So in brief, what we're trying to do today is to understand this latest attack on Armenia's borders. And this, we will focus on the global scale, global stakes of this attack on Armenia's international borders. And those stakes are very high. It is an attack on an international border. And as such, it changes the structure of the conflict completely. And as such, this particular attack is quite similar to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. This is an attempt at a territorial conquest, And as such, it weakens the most important norm that has been allowing international stability since the end of World War II. It's the norm on the prohibition of militarized territorial acquisition, the norm against conquest. So this is a little bit of context before I hand over to our panelists. In terms of a format, we'll try to understand first what's happening, why now, what are the causes. We'll then move to the consequences. And when we do move to the consequences, we'll try to understand the consequences on the pretty much shattered peace process, prospects for getting back to the negotiation table, impact on Armenia's statehood, sovereignty, and of course, I think the Nancy Pelosi's visit is pretty important. Nerses Kopalyan wrote a very important article on this that is out on EVN Report today. I invite you to look at this. And Sossi has been writing a lot on on various paths of conflict resolution, remedial sovereignty. So there's a lot of expertise on this panel with these two speakers. I can't wait to get going. So let me stop here, and perhaps let's start with Sossi, since Sossi is on the ground, although Nerses has not been sleeping, as I'm realizing as well. So I don't know who is on the ground, who is not. But Sossi, if you could tell us, if you could very briefly say what has been happening, what's the mood in Yerevan, and your assessment actually, what caused this? What is the primary trigger, if there is one?
Thank you very much for inviting me to this seminar, even if on this very dramatic situation in Armenia. This is the largest military aggression that, to which sovereign Armenia has been subjected to so far, because this we should clearly distinguish that this is not about Nagorno-Karabakh any longer. This is about sovereign territory of Armenia, its southern eastern regions, and not even one region, but three regions, Sunik, Vayodzor, and Gerarkunik. So we have lost territories as a result of this aggression. There are 80,000 people displaced. There are over 200 victims, out of which at least 3 are civilians. There are war crimes. There are war crimes because those military servicemen who have been surrounded, and they have been killed. Moreover, they have been tortured, mutilated, and dismembered, including 3 or 4 women military servicemen. And believe me, I've seen the videos. It's horrific. It's worse than ISIS towards Yazidis. It's worse than what I've seen in the Central African Republic during the conflict. So this is a real violation of international order and international law. Its most important principles, such as territorial integrity and prohibition of the use of force. And this is an attack on a sovereignty of an internationally recognized state and its territorial integrity. And this is a threat to our statehood. This is the first time when Armenia used actually the most important mechanism in international order, which is the UN Security Council. Even last year when Save Lake was attacked and we lost 41 square kilometers, we didn't appeal to the Security Council, but this time we did. And there were 2 sessions, one closed and one open past week. We can talk, of course, about how these sessions went, but now I don't want to get into details so far. And there are intensive negotiations. Armenia appealed to a CSTO mechanism. As usual, so far it hasn't produced any results. It's the same situation as we had last year when Save Lake was attacked. We had Pelosi visit, we had French President Macron and US State Secretary Blinken regularly calling Prime Minister Pashinyan and President Aliyev, and today Blinken organized a meeting between Armenian and Azerbaijani foreign ministers in the margins of the UN Security Council. Now, the question is why now? Of course, there are many reasons for that. First of all, Azerbaijan, it was obvious that Azerbaijan was going to launch another military escalation because there were all signals for it: military buildup, total hybrid war, disinformation campaign against Armenia. I've written a very large article about this. It is conducting an aggressive campaign of false narratives against both Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, and it was accusing Armenia in violating ceasefire and making military escalations, which doesn't make any sense because neither Armenia nor Nagorno-Karabakh have absolutely no reason and motivation to do so. It's an obvious disinformation campaign. Also, there was this meeting mediated by the European mission in Brussels, and there was a general statement about preparation of a peace treaty. And of course, Nagorno-Karabakh issue is always complicated because basically what Azerbaijan demands from Armenia is to completely refuse from supporting Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians for their claim for self-determination. However, Azerbaijan doesn't want to give them any status, even autonomy. They just want them to get integrated into Azerbaijan, not as an entity, but as just regular Azerbaijani citizens with no civil and political rights. And also, it's not just that, because they don't stop there. They go beyond, as we see, and they make many territorial claims to Armenia. They are claiming that even Yerevan has been an ancient Azeri land. They are distorting the history. They have territorial claims to most of Armenian regions: Syunik / Zangezur, Geharkunik, Vayodzor, Tavush, and they are also demanding delimitation and demarcation of borders, which we agree, and we are also interested in this. However, even during that process, they are trying to make territorial claims. And finally, one of the most aggressive demands by Azerbaijan is an extraterritorial corridor that will link Azerbaijan with Nakhichevan through Syunik, Meghri, and they don't accept that Armenia will have checkpoints on that road and charge custom fees. They just want it to be surrounded with a fence, Russian security forces controlling it, and they just want to use it with no any restrictions. And they make a parallel between it and Lachin corridor, which doesn't make sense again, because Nagorno-Karabakh and Nakhichevan are two completely different entities, and there cannot be any parallel between them. Of course, I don't want to get into details of this particular issue, but we can discuss it later. So it's very, very complicated. This is a threat to basically it's an existential threat. And we are very much relying that the international community will understand this. This is also a regional threat with regional and global implications. And we very much rely on the support by international community, and international fact-finding mission, to my opinion, should be urged. And also, who knows, maybe international monitoring mission to really respect the ceasefire and not to have further losses. And in fact, we absolutely need Azerbaijan to withdraw its troops to several pieces of territories of sovereign Armenia that it has captured since last year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sossi. That was very comprehensive. Nerses, do you want to jump in on as to why now? And then I have a specific question for you, Nerses.
Sure, thank you, Anna. Pleasure to be here. There are a couple of factors here that explain sort of, the nature of Azerbaijan's aggression and a time factor. Most of the conversations that we're hearing in certain policy circles, and especially what's coming out of Brussels, is that the most recent negotiations about 2 weeks ago really did not go well. And in that context, Azerbaijan's demands cannot be met by Armenia. And Azerbaijan has come to the realization that what they failed on the battlefield to achieve with the ceasefire, they have been attempting to get that through negotiations. And an inability to impose their will through negotiations is basically what is triggering the current behavior. And so basically about a week and a half after negotiations, we saw a very aggressive increase in Azeri armament in the region areas. And this is where, as Sossi noted, we saw their further amplification of gray zone tactics and hybrid warfare mechanisms. So immediately after the Brussels negotiations, we saw an increase in Azerbaijani brinksmanship, rhetoric, and the ground was laid for an expansive incursion. Now, we were assuming that this was an incursion, but in essence, this was a large-scale invasion. When we're talking about nearly 30 targets, including villages, population centers, so on and so forth, that were hit, some 200 houses and properties, infrastructure being damaged, that is not a surgical operation, that is not a specific incursion. It was, in essence, a large-scale invasive attempt. So the timing is consistent with what Baku considers to be an inability to extract demands with the recent Brussels negotiations. Now, there's quite a bit of literature that explains Baku's behavior. The broader literature on negotiations suggests that developments in the battlefield shape negotiating outcomes. And what we're seeing is that Azerbaijan's fundamental objective was the complete absorption of Nagorno-Karabakh, of Artsakh, during the war. This did not happen. And so they are attempting to achieve that within the negotiations. The fact that they're refusing any discussion of status and they're suggesting that the issue is resolved, this is their attempt of attaining or seeking to attain what they were not able to achieve during the fighting in 2020. At the same time, what we are seeing is that the claims that they are making on Armenia's territory in the south is twofold. One, yes, the issue of the corridor is a part of it, but this is also a leveraging mechanism. What Azerbaijan is arguing is that if you're going to make claims against what they call a sovereign Azerbaijani territory, i.e. Nagorno-Karabakh, then they're going to create a buffer zone or absorb Armenian territory and use that as a leverage in attaining what they want to attain. So this is basically multifaceted. There are the territorial considerations that are being utilized as for leverage, and there are also the failures in negotiations from the lens of Azerbaijan. And so this is where they are resorting to force. I don't think anybody has illusions about this. The West sees this. Obviously, the United States has come out surprising in the sense that of previous behavior that we've seen. They've come out quite aggressively in their approach on the issue and attempting to fill the vacuum that they're seeing. But Azerbaijan is not getting what it wants on the negotiating table, so it is resorting to force. That, at this point, seems to be the primary explanatory factor for this large incursion we saw.
Very good. Thank you very much, Nerses. And if we could continue, if we could stay with that theme of gray zone tactics that you mentioned, that this was not, there's a lot of research documenting that moving forward with this great power rivalry heightening, we're going to see a lot more sort of quote unquote military operations, quite similar to also to what Turkey did in with the Kurdish population in Syria. And my sense with this was that Azerbaijan may be trying to copy paste Turkey's behavior in Syria relative to the core zones that it created. So thinking forward, short of, I think the states are still going to be hesitant to engage full-blown wars of conquest, even though Azerbaijan has demonstrated significant capacity on it and willingness to do it. But short of that, as countries try to engage in this limited gray zone tactics, what do you think, how should states respond in general, and Armenia in particular, what components of the, aside from the military, what else needs to be happening in kind of pushing back against these types of operations, which I don't think are going to cease?
So there are two important factors to consider before we get to those potential actions that Armenia could take, or any state could take in the face of the given situation outside of military means. One, we need to note that Azerbaijan has been able to do this, at least expand the gray zone tactics into a broader military invasion, because the Russian-led security architecture has collapsed. The underlying assumption was for the longest time that as long as you have Russian troops guarding Armenia's borders, or that as long as Russian troops provide security per the 1997 bilateral treaty, that Armenia proper cannot be attacked. So under that logic, there was a sense of security that Azerbaijan would not attempt to do what it did last week. So the collapse of the Russian security architecture is the biggest explanatory factor that kind of is explaining why Azerbaijan is doing what they're doing. In essence, there is an element of impunity that they feel, that they sense, that's driving this behavior. So we have gone from hybrid gray zone tactics to full military invasion. The extent to which this is going to be expanded is very, very straightforward. Azerbaijan has every intention of expanding these operations. This is not a one-time thing, and I am convinced that observing the scope and magnitude of the recent assault, the next one, if they're able to pull it off, is going to be much broader. We should not have any illusions about that, because this is an extension of a broader policy, it's a grand strategy that they have developed. Now, what could Armenia do? Of course, the military components are very straightforward as far as fighting back, preparing, so on and so forth. But at the non-military level, the configurations here are threefold. One, we already saw France leading the initiative at the UN Security Council in advancing this issue. The expectation is that if there is another incursion of this sort, that not only France, but the United States, after the Pelosi visit, after the active involvement of Secretary Blinken, the United States will also join France in fully pushing this hard at the UN Security Council. So there's one component there. Second, of course, is back channel diplomacy and the involvement of not just France, the EU, and the United States, but also individual states that have some leverage in controlling Azerbaijan's behavior. It's no secret that the recent ceasefire was primarily secured by the United States. And generally speaking, if you look at the behavior of European actors, they usually follow the American lead. Talking points are very similar, positions are similar. Sossi will attest to this. Whenever we speak to European diplomats, they basically, to a large extent, follow the American lead when it comes to issues in the South Caucasus, specifically between conflicts of Azerbaijan and Armenia are concerned. So it's basically an amplification of intense diplomatic involvement with the utilization of international legal instruments. But those, again, might temporarily serve as deterrents at a limited level. But broadly speaking, unless Azerbaijan receives what they consider to be rightfully theirs, until that issue is addressed, we're not going to see, in any sense, a sense of security, or at least a form of behavior that could lead to some stabilization of the situation. So I'm not convinced at this point that we are seeing positive progress. What we are seeing is Azerbaijan finding mechanisms, reasons, and excuses to justify its behavior. So far, it hasn't worked. But at the same time, I think they're banking on the fact that they may be able to prolong this posturing, and that should attention be diverted from Armenia or the current situation, they may reinitiate their approach. So to this end, we again come back to a very, very important point. With the collapse of the Russian security architecture and the fact that the CSTO has become primarily irrelevant, is there a security guarantee for Armenia? And if not, then clearly the next steps are going to be very, very severe. But if diplomatic pressure is robust to the extent where it's going to control Azerbaijan's behavior, then we could take the conversation to the next level.
Very good. Thank you very much, Nerses, for that. Sossi, if we could go back, you mentioned, and we're talking about the mediation process. The way I looked at this is that while he did not get what he wanted, the negotiations did not go very well, but I think it was also a good excuse for Aliyev to essentially bulldoze through the European track, which is a lot more sort of oriented towards the status of the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. It's largely broadly within the quote unquote liberal peace building framework. So essentially, with perhaps Russia's blessing, he did bulldoze through the European track, mediation track. And that essentially is also typical of how Russia has been dealing with peace processes elsewhere. So, Sossi, do you think, to what extent do you think it was calculated, if at all, in terms of crushing the European track, the Western track of mediation, of peace process? And to what extent, how do you see what possible roles can United Nations play, considering the limitations that it also has in conflict management?
Thank you. Just to add also what Nerses said, I'm not sure I 100% agree with this assessment, because basically what has been happening is that Russia wants the postponement of the status issue and postponement of the resolution of the Nagorno-Karabakh issue, and Europeans wanted to resolve it within the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. But it is sabotaged by Azerbaijan, that is not promising any status to Nagorno-Karabakh, which also puts the European Union in a very difficult situation, as well as Americans. So now, basically, I completely agree with Nerses' point that Azerbaijan basically is aiming to create a mirroring, a parallel territorial claim. Basically, it has been saying, since you want Nagorno-Karabakh, which is part of my territorial integrity, then I'm claiming, let's say, Zangezur and not only, which is extremely and incredibly dangerous. And we should kill this parallel as much as we can. And I think that today, the president of Nagorno-Karabakh did a huge step just a few hours ago. It made a statement where he basically said that nobody can decide the fate of Nagorno-Karabakh without Nagorno-Karabakh. And he expressed his willingness to negotiate with Azerbaijan directly. And I believe that this is also what European Union would support, and most likely also US. And this is really helpful. We need to separate right now Nagorno-Karabakh issue and the invasion of Armenia proper. This is the right way to go, both for Armenia and Artsakh, both. Because otherwise we may lose both, you know. If we don't separate those two issues, we may lose both. Concerning the CSTO, I've been thinking about this for 2 years, and right now I think we have reached a point when we may really decide to lead. This is my personal view, and not only mine, but liberal, progressive, expert community and civil society in Armenia, that CSTO is not just not helping us, but it has become a prison for us. Because, okay, let's keep Armenian-Russian alliance because it's still our only security guarantee. But CSTO consists of countries with whom we have neither geopolitical common interests nor common values, such as we are adhering to human rights and democracy, and they are not. And we don't have anything in common because those countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan are members of the organization to Turkic states that made a statement supporting Azerbaijan against Armenia last week. We have Belarus, which has much closer relations with Azerbaijan than with Armenia. So apart from Russia, with whom we have an alliance, but that also reached almost the same level of alliance with Azerbaijan as with us, because one day before the Ukrainian war started, Putin and Aliyev signed this declaration where they elevated their partnership level to the level of the alliance, and there is even a provision there about mutual recognition of territorial integrity and other very important security-related provisions. So it can also explain the behavior of Russia, because now basically it has similarly close relations with Armenia and Azerbaijan. And of course, since Azerbaijan has oil, it increases its leverage. And of course, right now there is a military asymmetry between Azerbaijan and Armenia, which also gives to Azerbaijan additional leverage. But for this very reason, we really need to use any political and quasi-legal and legal mechanism within the international framework that we can, starting from the UN Security Council. This is very serious, and fortunately, France, which is a partner country, is chairing it this month, and we should use it to absolute maximum. We should not say, okay, there was a session, there was no resolution, and that's it. No, you never get Security Council resolution at once. It's always a process. We need to work every day with all member states of the UN Security Council. First of all, of course, permanent members, but not only, because we need to work with African countries, we need to work with Emirates, where India, of course, India is one of our biggest partners too. And we need to use also other mechanisms. We need to request Security Council to send international fact-finding mission, not necessarily by the UN itself, but it may delegate it to a regional organization such as OSCE or even EU, although I guess yes, OSCE is better in our case because we, Russia and Azerbaijan, are all members to the OSCE, as well as all Western Euro-Atlantic states. So it's more inclusive. And we should forget CSTO because it's obvious that it just doesn't work for us, and maybe we need to leave it. And why? Because of CSTO, we are not able to purchase weapons from any Western NATO member country. This has become a prison for us. And in order to do defense reform, we do need to consult Western partners, European Union and NATO member countries, and yeah, we need to purchase weapons. And for that very reason, CSTO has become a prison. We need to keep Armenian-Russian bilateral military alliance, but we need to refuse from this outdated mechanism that doesn't work for us. And finally, one more point, we absolutely need to ratify the Rome Statute as soon as possible, like in the next few days. We have a constitutional legal issue. There is a constitutional inconsistency between the Rome Statute and our constitution, but it can be resolved. There are ways to resolve it, and we need to ratify the Rome Statute, which means that then we will accept the jurisdiction of International Criminal Court, after which we can appeal to the International Criminal Court for war crimes committed by Azerbaijan in our sovereign territory, because so far we are able to make claims only to the International Court of Justice within our already existing case and European Court of Human Rights. And we absolutely need to add International Criminal Court to the legal mechanisms that we can use. Thank you.
That's a very important point, Sossi. I mean, the fact that Armenia has not ratified the the Rome Statute is really critical, but I would probably imagine, I don't know enough as to whether there would be a clause against activating, ratifying it while in conflict. I don't know, but still,
no, there isn't.
Okay, there's nothing. Okay, so we will come back to CSTO. But one more question, and Nerses, I want to go to you, but I do want to delve into the CSTO, Russia's role, and then maybe we can connect to Sossi's research on CSTO as well as to Nerses' article today. I hear you. I hear sort of in the public discourse as well, two things. On the one hand, there seems to be an assumption or belief that this attack happened because peace negotiations, the negotiations in Brussels did not go well. Meaning that is this attack and in general Azerbaijani behavior about Karabakh, the assumption being if he gets what he wants in Nagorno-Karabakh, his behavior will change. But I'm not sure that that's the case. Are we also seeing Azerbaijani internally driven regional military dominance? And if it's that the case, that probably should be changing Armenia's diplomatic structure, diplomatic posture, the selection of its partners, and Georgia probably also needs to be thinking somewhat differently about this conflict.
So that's a very good point on the relationship between regional configurations and domestic configurations. So a lot of times they're interconnected, especially with authoritarian regimes, and regime survival to a large extent tends to be reliant on creating external problems to maintain domestic stability. This clearly is consistent with the behavior of the Aliyev regime. And so, right, to what extent, if the Nagorno-Karabakh issue, for example, is somehow resolved through a peace treaty, would that curtail potential behavior by Azerbaijan? None of us are convinced. In essence, until Armenia develops sufficient deterrence capabilities, the behavior of the Aliyev regime will not be curtailed, even if some form of peace treaty is agreed to. And that, in of itself, does not look probable by virtue of the extremist or very maximalist claims that Azerbaijan is making and demanding. So to that end, you're sort of stuck in a very vicious cycle. You negotiate, you come to some conclusions, and then when you're close to coming to some conclusions, exogenous factors such as domestic concerns might come up, which would lead to possibly Baku sabotaging those developments and thus instigating an interstate militarized dispute to deal with domestic issues. So that is going to be consistent and prevalent. I don't imagine that the Azerbaijani government is incentivized to find a peace solution, and this works consistently in their favor. It allows them to basically maintain the momentum that they have. It allows them to maintain the regime. It allows them to seem regionally relevant, and also the ability to create instability and then back off and give the illusion of creating stability allows them a great deal of regional leverage. And so they become actors by at times manufacturing the conflict and then solving that conflict. Very consistent with we see the behavior of Turkey when it comes to Greece, for example. So in that context, those similarities are there. But fundamentally, I'm in agreement with you in that the domestic variable is important here. But the one distinction is that the extent to which European and America is going to allow that kind of behavior. We haven't seen this level of American involvement as long as I can remember. The direct involvement of Secretary Blinken was robust throughout these negotiations. He continuously speaks with both sides. And so we are seeing a sense of urgency from the United States that we have not seen previously. Whether this is part of a grand strategy, I argue it is, or whether it's not, the fact of the matter is you're seeing a level of US engagement we have not seen in the past. So I don't know if the model that Azerbaijan was anticipating is sustainable, but clearly that is their intent going forward.
Very good. Thank you very much. Let's now go back to the question of CSTO. I now, and I'm hoping to hear from both of you on this. There is a now pretty heated debate on CSTO. Sossi already mentioned several factors, but I want to push back a little and be a devil's advocate. And it's hard to measure this clearly, but number one, on the one hand, one could argue that while CSTO has not delivered for Armenia in terms of protecting its international borders, and it's clearly a dictator's club, but at the same time, there are other organizations, for example, ASEAN, that is populated with democracies and authoritarian states. So I think the mismatch between political system is not such big of a factor. And I wonder, though, for Armenia to remain, again, I'm being a devil's advocate, but I'm not sold on this, Armenia being at CSTO, what they provide Armenia with some sort of a constraining mechanism over these nations in not doing worse than they would have done without discrediting the organization completely. That's number one, as to what you think about this. And number two, what are the risks of Armenia either suspending CSTO or leaving CSTO membership? And I think, okay, I'll stop here, and then there's something specific in your article, Nerses. Sossi, let's go to you, and then I'll come back to Nerses on this again. Yeah?
Yeah, that has been exactly the fear, because basically, since last year, since the Sev Lake capture, staying in CSTO has become conditioned only by the fear of increasing the risks if we leave it. But I'm sorry, you cannot stay in an organization only not to increase your security risks. I understand that it's tricky, and until last week, to be honest, I myself thought that it's risky, and I was trying to evaluate the risks. What is more risky, to stay in CSTO or to leave CSTO? Since the beginning of the Ukrainian war, because basically CSTO has become also a club of states who are not very positively perceived by the Euro-Atlantic community, with which we have more commonalities in terms of human rights and democracy. And therefore we have appeared in a club with whom we don't have much in common in terms of values. But right now, after the behavior of CSTO countries, when there was this field visit to Jermuk that has been shelled very severely, and Jermuk, one of our most beautiful towns, a resort town, has suffered a lot because of this recent invasion. And Foreign Ministry and Defense Ministry organized this field visit of the diplomats, ambassadors, and other diplomats accredited to Armenia to Jermuk. And all CSTO countries refused to go. I'm sorry, but this is just very, very strange. When they go to Shushi and they don't go to Jermuk. And this was for me the last point when I realized that we cannot stay in this organization. We cannot bear the stigma of being in this organization in the eyes of the Euro-Atlantic community without gaining any benefit from it, but suffering because of our membership. Some analysts suggest that if we leave CSTO, Azerbaijan may enter it, and we may not be able to veto it because we are not there anymore. I don't think so. I think Azerbaijan has held a very diversified, multipolar foreign policy for many years now, which their analysts call something like equal distancing from both the West and Russian CSTO. And it has actually been very wise in that sense. And I don't think that Azerbaijan would be interested in entering CSTO. I don't see it happening. Therefore, the only concern would be whether Russia will get upset with us and penalize us. But I think this is something that absolutely needs to be negotiated between Armenia and Russia. And Armenia should negotiate this with Russia, underlining that we do need military assistance. And in fact, Russia is not able to provide us at the moment because of the Ukraine war, because it is stretched, its capacity is stretched in terms of its own military operations, and we are just not able to buy weapons from Russia or something like that. Of course, there is no any guarantee that if we leave CSTO, suddenly we will get deals with Western states. Absolutely, I don't see any guarantee, but at least we will be free. And For me, I've never, although I've been the head of the NATO section in the Armenian diplomatic service many years ago, and our deputy ambassador to NATO, I'm not saying let's enter NATO because it's just not realistic. It's a dream. Even if we wanted it, it's not realistic because we are so far from NATO standards. We would need at least 20 years to reach them. And we have a problem of Turkey being a NATO member that would most likely veto it if it vetoes even the membership of Finland and Sweden. No, absolutely not. But we need to, do defense reform, and we cannot do defense reform if we stay in CSTO. We need to use models, defense models of countries with whom we have more similarities in terms of geography, in terms of democracy, demography. And those countries are countries like Finland and Austria and Switzerland, neutral countries that have adopted defense models of like auxiliary or reserve. And, these models that are, and they have mountains, very similar landscape with Armenia. We need to use elements. By the way, when I was working for many years in the UN dealing security sector reform, you never copy a model of any country for your defense reform, but you just can take various elements from different countries. It can be Finland, it can be Switzerland, it can be Singapore, it can be Israel, it can be eventually Russia, and combine them, customizing them to your own needs of your defense needs. So this is what is my own personal view, that just CSTO doesn't serve us anymore.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Sossi. Nerses, you mentioned in your article, and I'm hoping you can address the CSTO Russia factor, but in your article, you mentioned something today that it appeared that the West, the United States, is not necessarily pushing Armenia to abandon its security commitment in exchange for different new and different, more diversified forms of defense cooperation. If you could elaborate on that, and what would that look like short-term and long-term?
My understanding is that the United States pretty much views CSTO to be an irrelevant organization, and that the CSTO has demonstrated this time and time again. So in that context, prior to the recent escalation, there were already suspicions about whether CSTO as an institution, as a security organization, was able to achieve its objectives or fulfill its minimal responsibilities. Now, the understanding was that they were not fulfilling, quote unquote, their duties for political reasons. But the recent incursion demonstrated that it's not just political reasons, but rather they have structural problems and they lack the means and ability to do so. Simply put, everybody knows that CSTO is an extension of Russia. And considering the extent to which Russia has been weakened, the CSTO has no substantive relevance. So putting pressure on Armenia to leave an irrelevant organization would be an exercise in futility, just doesn't matter. This is why, when even Frank Pallone spoke in Yerevan, he kind of made the point that they are navigating ways to bypass this issue, or they're not even really considering it an issue. So those are very, very, very interesting developments. But the point that I would make is that, whether Armenia is part of the CSTO or not, substantively doesn't change anything on the ground. But it is a constraining factor, as Sossi suggested, because it limits Armenia's capacity to engage in the international arms market. But Armenia does need to be methodical about this, because at the end of the day, CSTO is more political than anything else. My approach would be to initially suspend membership and then find a way around that. Because once it becomes overly politicized, Russia's capacity for a punitive approach might be problematic. So the intent isn't to antagonize Russia, but to simply demonstrate that, listen, since 2020 war, Russia has not sold any weapons to Armenia. Okay, that's a fact. So by being in CSTO, Armenia is not able to purchase weapons from relevant countries. So we're not receiving weapons, we're not able to purchase weapons. Is Armenia being basically established to be the sacrificial lamb? Okay, this is a fundamental issue that needs to be addressed. In that context, I think suspending it and then going to the international arms market is a very rational approach. I think today, if I read correctly, Nerses Kopalyan, who's head of the Parliamentary Committee on Arms and Defense, did note that Armenia is going to start purchasing weapons on the international market. So obviously steps are being taken. But it is in this context that I'm suggesting that the CSTO needs to be depoliticized from Armenia's lens. And if Armenia's Western partners suggest that, listen, we need some kind of a mechanism where we could allow you to purchase weapons and bypass the CSTO issue, and that mechanism could be suspension as opposed to leaving it, then that would be sort of the healthy middle ground so that Russia is not antagonized. So that is primarily what I'm seeing, the discussions that I'm seeing. But I agree with what Sossi said. This is very, very straightforward. CSTO is like a bad insurance company. Even when you have the most simple claim, you apply to them, they deny you. And so what is the purpose of having that insurance company if it's not going to, pay for the most simple care that you need? And this is the issue. It consistently denies Armenia. And in the context, it has come to the point that where it's no longer political. Also, I think in the past, whereas Armenian society, Armenian political culture was very careful not to display any anti-CSTO sentiments, it's very evident that there is a robust public tide turning against this. And that provides the political cover for Armenia's government to be able to at least maneuver with the suspension discourse and purchasing arms in the international market.
One more question, and I will open this up to the audience, and we'll start taking. There are already some questions that we can take. But Nerses, I'll go to you, and then I'll go to Sossi. And I'm citing your words that were so polite. Russia's capacity for punitive action. How would that play out? And I'm assuming Russia does have significant hybrid warfare capacity inside Armenia.
It's not just that. I mean, Robert Kopalyan did a big favor to Russia by basically selling much of Armenia's industries to them, natural resources to them, and primarily making Armenia resource reliant on Russia. So from Russia's control of natural gas to basically being a big trade partner, there's an inherent dependency, okay? This is good old traditional dependency theory. And in that context, being within that dependency structure, it allows the stronger party to exercise exponential levers in being able to provide, engage in punitive action. It's very, very simple. For example, Russia's health ministry, for example, could say, Armenian agricultural products don't meet Russian standards, therefore we can't bring them. That will have a severe effect, for example, on Armenian farmers. They could increase gas, they could cut off gas, they're doing repairs, whatever. Again, serious repercussions. So there are various mechanisms that could be utilized by Russia to actually punish Armenian society. It would not be blatant, but it would be tacit and be very, very harmful because Armenia is a very, very fragile country. So those things have to be gauged very, very carefully. And the backup or contingency plans need to be developed for these factors. So any serious lever that Russia has that will allow them to engage in punitive behavior, Armenia has to consider an alternative before taking the step of either freezing CSTO or engaging in a discourse that Russia may find distasteful. So this is a very, very delicate balance. There are mechanisms, but it needs to be approached carefully. And also, yes, on the very aspect of the hybrid warfare on the military front. It's no secret that a big chunk of Armenia's military leadership are trained in Moscow. Armenia's National Security Service, agents are trained in Moscow. This is not a question of loyalty or anything like that. But when you have a country that trains very much the elite of your security apparatus, there are relationships, there are structural relationships, there are intelligence sharing relationships. So there are a lot of factors that could become problematic in that sector as well. So Russia is so integrated to Armenia's social structures, economic structures, security structures that it cannot be easily disentangled. This is why the whole process has to be handled in a very methodical fashion, so it doesn't get to the point of what we're being concerned about punitive outcomes, but rather we could have a healthy conversation with them and do things in a structure where it doesn't lead to any serious fallouts.
Very good. Thank you very much, Sossi, any more thoughts before we go to the questions?
Yeah, I would like to add a couple of points. Since the war and our military defeat, there was this controversy in the Armenian political discourse, democracy versus security, and it was claimed by the conservative opposition and relevant groups that, associated groups, that we were attacked and we lost our security because we had adopted democracy and we had a revolution. In the reality, Azerbaijan was preparing for a war for 2.5 decades, and we were just being lazy. Because I have written in my book that I published as a NATO Defense College fellow still in 2007, that Azerbaijan is just investing most of its oil and gas profits in its military industry and preparing for the war. So it was obvious for many years, and it was also conducting most aggressive disinformation campaign diplomatically. I've been a diplomat myself. I've been in NATO, I've been in UN specialized agencies in Vienna, and in any forum, in any international meeting, whether it's about drugs or about nuclear plants or about whatever, Azerbaijan shows up and starts its disinformation campaign, and it starts rooting its false narratives in the subconsciousness of the international community. While Armenian diplomacy was kind of dry and lazy, we thought since we have won in the first Nagorno-Karabakh war, we can just preserve the status quo. So we were neither keen on resolving the Nagorno-Karabakh issue when it was there were more opportunities for that, like in the after the war in the second half of 90s, in mid and second half of 90s, or taking advantage of Kosovo's independence, Timor-Leste's independence, South Sudan independence based on remedial secession principle in the beginning of 2000. We were lazy. We weren't using those precedents. At the same time, we weren't using international legal mechanisms to prove that we had a just case. We kept those 7 surrounding territories, which I believe was a mistake because we had to return 5 of them. 2 of them, Lachin and Kelbajar, are a different issue, but those 5 territories became an issue that stigmatized us in the eyes of the international community as well, and it gave an opportunity to Azerbaijan to stigmatize us. So our diplomacy was lazy. We weren't robust in responding to false narratives by Azerbaijan. So we made a lot of mistakes. Plus, we weren't preparing for the war because we weren't reforming our defense army. We weren't catching up with contemporary standards of the defense sector, with NATO standards, while Turkey was mentoring Azerbaijan to achieve certain standards of NATO and quite robust state of its military. So we have made huge mistakes. Okay. And yes, there is also a hybrid war in Armenia because of our conservative opposition that have strong connections with Russia, and they are also part of certain false narratives that harm our diplomacy. And I have to say that even our officials, because sometimes our authorities also make some statements that can be used against Armenia. So it's both authorities and the opposition. But I think this current situation made our authorities reassess the situation and their agendas and narratives. And now they see that Azerbaijan really doesn't just want Nagorno-Karabakh. It's not going to stop there. It is in euphoria because of its military victory and because of the collapse of international order and this impunity of the use of force. And it's just not going to stop unless there is a strong deterrence. Thank you. Sorry if I spoke long.
Very good. Thank you very much, Sossi. So there is a question. I'm going to go to the questions. And Nerses, I wonder if you can comment on this. Actually picks up on what Sossi already started. Few sources are reporting that Azerbaijan and Turkey are preparing for another invasion. When and will the more short-term questions? We did not cover this extensively. Will US and others be able to prevent another invasion? What are short-term strategies? How does our Nerses, I know you have worked a lot on military reform, and you actually have been writing as to how well, and I agree with you, Armenian army responded to this last attack to a great sacrifice. Do you think Armenian military in this current state will be able to withstand for how long, and what type of leverage can the United States bring over the situation? Are we talking sanctions or not? I have a feeling sanctions are perhaps the most important tool. Sanctions on Aliyev as a family, not necessarily on the country.
So these sources are in secret. At the UN Security Council meeting, Armenia's representative spoke about accumulation of forces in Azerbaijan and the threat that's being posed. Just last night, the vice president of Armenia's parliament mentioned in a conversation that there's accumulation of forces and there's a fear of an imminent threat. So Armenia's leadership is openly talking about this. Clearly, it could be a combination of raising the alarm to have more international pressure, but there's clearly some substance there. So that's not a secret. From the lens of what could be done, indeed, the reforms, relative reforms, limited reforms that we've seen in the operational capacity of the Armenian armed forces, the 3-month training programs that have been developed for incoming conscripts, have demonstrated, relatively speaking, progress based on the performance that we saw in 2020, exponential improvement. But fundamentally, there's a severe disparity in both firepower and in advanced technological warfare, specifically drone warfare. In that context, that puts us at a continuous disadvantage. So militarily, it's a very difficult conversation to have as to the extent to which we'll be able to hold back. At the same time, Armenia is developing territorial defense forces. The law was passed in 2018, I think. It's being implemented. And so different mechanisms are being created. In times of desperation, there's no other option but to fight back to the maximum. We're hoping to not get to that. My understanding is that the direct and immediate involvement of the United States was a recognition of this. The United States is not going to apply its resources and put its reputation online if it did not think that something imminent and very dangerous was about to happen. In that context, the continuous direct involvement of the US, even Secretary Blinken going out of his way to hold a meeting in the UN as we are speaking right now between the two foreign ministers, and Nancy Pelosi's visit are important indicators. One thing that I do want to include in this discussion, Anna, and I mentioned, and I discussed this in my article, is that I view these developments as to be part of an extensive and a growing American policy. I'm calling this the U.S. pivot. And right before we began, Nancy Pelosi released another statement calling Armenia to be the front in the fight of democracy versus autocracy. Well, Armenia has never been the front of anything when it came to U.S. policy, and so the inclusion of Armenia into the conversation of Ukraine and Taiwan is kind of indicative that where the United States sees this. If Armenia was sort of this isolated, nascent democracy that's being threatened by a neighbor, we sympathize, but we're not going to apply resources. So the extent to which the attention that it's garnering suggests that America does view the preservation of Armenia's sovereignty and security to be somehow connected to America's broader interests. And I incorporate that into a discussion of the Biden doctrine. The extent to which we can be strategic about leveraging that and relying on the United States to curtail the possibility of invasion is the conversation at hand. And the United States, needless to say, has expansive resources to curtail the behavior of Azerbaijan. Sanctions I consider to be the nuclear option. I think the very mentioning or threat of it is sufficient to limit Azeri behavior. Now, Turkey comes into the question as it was posed. Turkey does provide Azerbaijan a lot of political cover. And this is the issue. If Azerbaijan is going to engage in a cost-benefit analysis, and they receive sufficient assurances from Turkey that they will be able to ride out any American pressure, then the configurations change. But at this point, I would make the point that the incorporation of Armenia into the broader Biden doctrine is, for the point being, given us some protection, or else I'm convinced that an incursion would have happened several days ago, and more so, I don't think the ceasefire would have been achieved, considering the fact that Russia failed to secure that ceasefire.
Actually, as you were talking, Nerses, on the one hand, I do agree with your assessment that this could be part of the Biden doctrine, the much stronger willingness of the Biden administration in defending democracies that are here, but also from pure geopolitics, the United States has been trying to revive, strengthen connections with India. It has created the Quad. It's trying to revive alliances with India, with Japan, all the way to Australia. So looking at Armenia from that angle in terms of connection through Eurasia might be worthwhile thinking about. In terms of, there are a few more questions. Sossi, I will go to you for that. One was the extent of the extent of Turkey-Azerbaijani military training cooperation. And there was that for you, Sossi. And then there is a question, and perhaps Nerses, you can take it. Do the current agreements, and I'm assuming this refers to CSTO, deter weapons manufacturing in Armenia? So Sossi, let's go to you first.
About NATO, Turkey, Azerbaijan military alliance, I would call it that way. It has actually become a model. I was in a closed event in Europe a few weeks ago in summer, and with participation of countries like Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, etc. And everybody was like looking up at this mentoring mechanism by Turkey for Azerbaijan, because in fact, Azerbaijan has not only participated in NATO's Partnership for Peace military exercises, but also got direct military assistance and instruction by Turkey. And it hasn't been all about weapons, because in fact, Turkey is not in top 2 or even 3 countries that has provided weapons to Azerbaijan. Well, of course, it has provided with Bayraktars, but Russia and Israel have sold more weapons to Azerbaijan than Turkey, to be honest. But what Turkey has provided them, apart from Bayraktars, it has been exactly Turkish military instructors command. For instance, during 2020 war, there is some evidence that, especially when it comes to Air Force, there have been high-level Turkish instructors sitting in Baku. And unfortunately, there is no any country with whom we can have such a mentoring mechanism as of now, because you know, the Turkey-Azerbaijan alliance has been based on one nation in 2 states slogan, and we don't really have a state who can assist us so much. But we can have cooperation with Greece, with France, with US, with other NATO and EU member countries, and I believe we can do it if we get rid of this CSTO restriction. And referring to what Nerses said, I would be very happy to know that we can just suspend our membership if it works. Whatever works, you know, whatever works for us to to waive this limitation for us. But we also need to negotiate with those countries in advance and to be sure that if we suspend our membership in CSTO, increasing the risks for us by them, we will get something in exchange of it, except just a political diplomatic credit that I hope we will get. And the second question, sorry, I forgot.
It was the Turkey Azerbaijan Corporation. My next question is on domestic manufacturing of weapons.
Yeah, okay.
No.
All right. The thing is that it's very complicated. It doesn't happen overnight. It sounds great. Let's produce weapons, but I'm sorry, it's not. Of course, we should get to that point, but it's not going to happen in a few months. It requires a lot of time to be able to have a military industry. And of course, this is one more thing that we have not done in the previous 20 years or so. Yes, I am for that. I am for as much self-sufficiency as we can get. Before 2020 war, I was not a huge fan of Israel model. I was arguing with experts who were advocating for it. But now, unfortunately, I see that this model makes sense for us because we need to be self-sufficient, if not as Israel, but like Singapore and Scandinavian neutral countries and Switzerland. And this is not just about weapons and military industry. This is about models. This is about auxiliary. This is about reserve, for which European countries such as Scandinavian, both NATO member and neutral countries, have very good models. We need to really study, and we have studied. Some experts have studied and produced papers on this or talked about this. We have to examine all elements that are useful for Armenia and start adopting them as soon as possible without losing even one day. Unfortunately, last 2 years we have been again lazy and slow.
There's actually a question here pointing out that the person saying that I know that there's weapons manufacturing is taking place in Armenia, but the government is not supporting this work. Nerses, do you want to jump in, Nerses? And then there's one more question, I'll get to it.
So the initial question about do the agreements that Armenia has, the CSTO agreements, we have digital weapons manufacturing. So Armenia has exponentially increased its weapons manufacturing programs. Interestingly, so they've been heavily diaspora-led, but I can't get into that. But we are having extensive development and it's in progress. Funding is there and experts are there, but again, it's a nascent industry. You cannot develop a military-industrial complex in a matter of a year or two, but it is a work in progress. And indeed, the government is supporting it. The government is involved. This is not stuff that's spoken about openly, but the Ministry of High Tech is extensively involved in this, as is the private sector. So in that context, work is being done. Now, but the deterring factor, the problematic factor here is that, yes, being part of the CSTO, it limits our capacity to produce the type of weapons that we need, because if we need certain type of chips, for example, or we need certain type of technology, we are not able to purchase those technologies, those parts from the international market because we're CSTO members, and those countries or those manufacturing firms are not allowed to sell to us. I've been part of negotiations where we had to go through 3-4 different types of waivers from the US State Department, only in the end to be turned down because of CSTO concerns. So in that context, it does create severe impediments to the potential quality of stuff that we could produce. And indeed, as Sossi noted, to be self-sufficient, where we can at least defend ourselves.
So it sounds like Nerses and Sossi that we're self-sanctioning ourselves when it comes to military production. Nerses, there is a question. What are the chances of a successful blitzkrieg type of invasion of Syunik with a pincer movement? Should Azerbaijan and Turkey attack or bomb larger civilian targets, including Yerevan? how should or could Armenia retaliate?
Well, the recent attack into Geopolitical and towards Jermuk was an attempt at a blitzkrieg. Luckily, not just luck, but through much sacrifice, this blitzkrieg was slowed down and deterred. The probability of a pincer movement is very high, but I don't think Turkey will get involved, but you would see Azeri forces trained by Turkey attacking from Nakhichevan if it comes to that, if we're talking about a pincer movement from both sides. I don't see Turkish direct involvement because the political cost and an international problem would be too high for them, and they have no reason to do that. From their length, Azerbaijan has sufficient weaponry, soldiers, training, and Turkish support to do it. So that, from that lens, that's an issue. But indeed, the probability, if you're going to see an invasion, will look something along those lines. Whether it'll be successful or not is a whole different dynamic. What could Armenia do? Well, we already talked about this, right? If we're talking about, a border incursion, quote unquote, as it's being presented, there's a reason why Azerbaijan frames it that way, because they could go to the international community and say, listen, we were quelling an attack against us, we had to do this, so on and so forth. So through their lens, they may utilize some international legal argument for their behavior. Yes, it's nonsense, but at least it gives them some rebuttal. But if they're going to do a pincer movement, fully invade a country, absorb parts of it, this is no longer a conversation about borderization, demarcation, or any security threats. This is a blatant violation of international law, which will create severe issues. And I would argue that that is the one thing that has limited Azerbaijan from doing this, the blowback from the international community. One could even argue that the recent Jermuk incursion was an attempt to gauge the international response. And the international response was very, very severe. And I think they were kind of caught off guard with that. But in that context, Armenia's retaliatory capacity is very, very limited, almost diminished, because for obvious reasons. One, you're not military deterrence capability. Two, we haven't really received much weapons from Russia for the last 2 years. And three, by the time you go into the international market, purchase stuff or the shipment that we're waiting from India, so on and so forth, these are, time-consuming processes. So our retaliatory capacity is very limited. Azerbaijan knows this. The collapse of the Russian security architecture contributes to that even more. In that context, there is no military solution on our end at this point. Therefore, the reliance is heavily on American actors, specifically, and European actors more expansively, to stop Azerbaijan from basically violating all international norms and creating problematic precedent that could pretty much be utilized by other countries to engage in the same kind of behavior.
I fully agree with that statement, Nerses. There is also, Sossi, there's a very good question, which reminds me that we did not get to talk about domestic politics in Azerbaijan in terms of the fact that this recent attack, in contrast to the 2020 war, is not as popular. There is massive suppression of activists. So the chances of a backlash, I don't know enough to see if there is enough to speak of a domestic backlash, but this is going to be costly as well for Azerbaijan domestically, especially if he does not win on the battlefield. So there is a question as to, even related to this, if the conflict is settled, what should be the main elements of long-term coexistence with Turkey and Azerbaijan? And I personally am much more optimistic in the long term, but that's just the immediate, the short term obviously is more problematic. I do think this is Aliyev's war, but Sossi, let me pass this to you.
Thank you. About domestic backlash, I can imagine, to be very frank with you, I haven't had a chance to follow a lot domestic developments in Azerbaijan, especially because we do have restrictions to access their websites. I can imagine that it's not popular, but I'm not too optimistic because Azerbaijan is an autocracy and there is no real civil society and expert community there. I had two chances to meet their experts in civil society in June. And to be honest, it was a bit shocking because basically they were just saying the same things as Aliyev, and some of them were saying more extreme things than Aliyev. Because I think what Azerbaijan is doing, sometimes they are using public diplomacy channels to communicate things that they cannot do it at official level. For instance, this anti-Russian narratives that Russia is an occupying force in Azerbaijan, making parallels with Ukraine and Georgia, which is a very unfavorable narrative for Armenia and Artsakh. They are doing it through public diplomacy channels because Aliyev has close relationship with Putin and cannot say it officially. About large-scale invasion and bombarding Yerevan, I agree with Nerses. I doubt Azerbaijan will do it because the political cost will be huge. Then Aliyev will become like Milosevic in Serbia many years ago. And I think that Azerbaijan is rather doing this borderization or creeping annexation, which I don't think is actually less dangerous. It's even more dangerous because Aliyev is saying it's not clear whether it's trying to claim that this was not happening in the territory of Armenia proper. It's bringing this argument that the border is not delimited and demarcated, which is not a justification. And unfortunately, CSTO country Kazakhstan said pretty much the same thing. And but there are international recognized borders, so this is a completely false justification. But yes, I do see a danger that Azerbaijan may go further and annex our border pieces of our border regions piece by piece, as it has already done last year and this year. And this is incredibly dangerous for that very reason, because it's not so explicit. Like even in the US Security Council, there was quite a confusion. While US and France and India were very clear, and there were elements of this in Norwegian and Irish and Albanian statements that this is not about Karabakh, this is about Southern Armenia. But when it comes to, let's say, Emirates or African countries, other states, they were confused. Or China, they were considering this as something like extension of Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, which is not. We need to separate the two. And apart from very much relying on the US support, as Nerses, I'm also very much relying on the French support, especially this month when US is presiding the UN Security Council, and Macron has also been very deeply involved. It had 2 telephone calls with Pashinyan in 72 hours and continues to be engaged at the moment in New York and in Paris, and also EU, because even if EU has a gas deal with Azerbaijan, EU also has values of human rights and democracy. And my understanding is that while EU is not clear about Nagorno-Karabakh because it's a much more complicated conflict, it is very robust when it comes to the territorial integrity of Armenia proper. So we need to rely on all those major actors in the international community to defer Azerbaijan, because yes, it's naive to think that we can militarily resist Azerbaijan for an extended period of time.
Very good. Thank you very much, Sossi. And we're getting short on time with 5 more minutes. And I want to get to this question on diaspora financing of the Armenian defense industry question. The question is, Nerses, whether Armenian defense industry directly or indirectly has any mechanism to engage with diaspora, considering that there might be citizenship limitations. There's another question pointing out that Israel does receive a lot of financing from its diaspora. So essentially, what are the mechanisms here, considering that the relationship between traditional main diaspora institutions in Armenia, right, have not been particularly functional since 2018. So I don't know what can be done in terms of coordination specifically on the defense issue, but the citizenship question is interesting. What do we know about the Israel model?
So structurally, you have an issue because nonprofit organizations, charity organizations in the United States cannot collect money and send money to Armenia for military purposes. That would be a violation of American law. This is why, relatively economically well-endowed organizations cannot assist Armenia economically with respect to the military thing, assistance. Individual citizens can participate, but obviously there are no open mechanisms where which Armenia can ask for funding to support arms procurement. Armenia does have the 1,000 plus program for raising funds from the diaspora to support troops, to support injured soldiers, so on and so forth. And that fund is ran by the Ministry of Defense. So there is a certain structures where diasporan citizens, members of the diaspora can send funds to Armenia that could be funneled to the defense ministry. But the diaspora being able to directly finance Armenia's arms industry and to do so in a structured fashion is problematic because most Western societies don't allow those kinds of things. So that's kind of where we're at. But I have not seen any initiatives at a systemic level where diaspora citizens collect funding and send it to the thing, to Armenia for arms procurement processes. These mechanisms don't exist. Also, Armenia as a country has a liability where which they cannot engage that kind of behavior as well. So if we're going to be honest about this, this is a lot of under the table conversation that we're having. And at the institutional bureaucratic level, you can't really do this. Now, there are mechanisms, right? If Armenia has to apply X amount of money for prosthetics for injured shoulders, procurement of food, boots, so on and so forth, and if sufficient funding is provided from the diaspora to cover those expenses, then Armenia can allocate those funds from the budget on their own for military expenses. So there are mechanisms. But to be quite honest, the diaspora has been pretty absent when it comes to raising or providing serious funding to Armenia. And the All Armenian Fund cannot engage in that kind of activities. So you have no other transnational or pan-Armenian structure that could support it. So it's usually either individual initiatives, which are very ad hoc, or nothing at the systemic level.
I said that would be our last question, but there is a member in the audience that is hoping that we can address this quickly. Iran's role. Does U.S. support jeopardize our relations with Iran? Nerses, that kind of goes into your Biden doctrine.
Yeah, absolutely not. Actually, I think earlier today, Ruben Rubinian, who's a vice president of parliament, was asked in an interview, and he said basically that they have spoken to the Iranians. Iran understands that Armenia's territorial integrity and security are paramount. And so the United States and Iran are actually aligned on this issue. In this context, I highly doubt it. Also, U.S.-Iranian relations are relatively speaking, improving as far as the nuclear treaties are concerned. There's progress being made. And so, Iran understands Armenia's tilt is fundamentally security related. In that context, I don't see any issues. For Iran would much prefer an American-supported secure Armenia than an Armenia that basically cannot defend itself, and Iran's only access north becomes absorbed by Azerbaijan and Turkey, which would be a geostrategic nightmare for Iran. So I don't think it's going to lead to any issues at that point.
Very good. Thank you so very much to both of you, Nerses Kopalyan, Sossi Tatikyan. This is for such a rich discussion, providing so much context as well as the nuance from the grand to granular, if I could put it this way. And I'm going to hand this back over to Zella.
Thank you so much. I mean, this was a fantastic discussion. I was getting texts all night long, and we kept the audience till now, which I'm very proud of that. And thank you for all the panelists to take time from your busy schedules to share with us your professional analysis. Very much appreciated. And a huge thank you to our attendees and listeners across the globe. So we had people from Switzerland. It was just amazing. London, Armenia, love it. Please look out for future AIWA events and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And if you're not already an AIWA member, we encourage you to do that by visiting our website at www.aiwainternational.org. Join and become part of our online community. Our mission is simple. It's to connect and elevate women globally through 3 strategic focus areas. Number 1, health and wellness. Number 2, education. And number 3, economic empowerment. Thank you again, everybody. Be healthy and be safe. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.